Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what truly matters. Elizabeth Van Cleef, a wealthy widow from St. Louis, finds herself stranded in the Montana Territory after her stagecoach is ambushed. Lost and alone, she stumbles upon a broken-down homestead where a starving mountain man makes her a desperate offer. "I haven't eaten in 3 days. Feed me and I'll serve you." Ezekiel Boone was once a respected Army scout, but war and grief have left him barely surviving in the wilderness. Elizabeth, tired of being waited on and carrying her own heavy losses, agrees to his bargain. What starts as a simple exchange between two desperate people becomes something neither expected. In the harsh Montana wilderness, these two wounded souls must learn to trust again. Can they find healing in each other's company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Elizabeth Van Cleef left St. Louis, she had worn her finest traveling dress, deep burgundy silk with ivory buttons that caught the light like tiny pearls. Her gloved hands had been soft as a child's, her posture straight as a church. Her silver hair arranged in the elaborate style that marked her as a woman of refinement and means. That morning felt like a lifetime ago now. Though only 3 days had passed since the ambush, she pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath coming in shallow puffs in the thin mountain air. Her once pristine dress hung in tatters, the silk torn by thorns and brambles, stained with dirt and her own blood from countless scratches. The gold locket at her throat, containing the only photograph she had of her dear departed husband Charles, felt heavy against her chest. It was all she had left of her old life, all that remained of the woman who had stepped aboard that ill-fated stagecoach. Charles had been gone 2 years now, taken by a weak heart that gave out one February evening as he sat reading by their parlor fire. She had found him there the next morning, his spectacles still perched on his nose, his book fallen open across his chest. The grief had nearly destroyed her, but she had endured it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 43 years of marriage. When his business partner informed her of the mining investments Charles had made in the Montana Territory, investments that required her personal attention to settle, she had seen it as providence, a chance to escape the suffocating sympathy of St. Louis society, to find purpose in the vast wilderness her husband had dreamed of but never seen. Now, shivering in the growing dusk, Elizabeth wondered if Charles had been trying to tell her something from beyond the grave. Perhaps this journey had never been about mining claims at all. The homestead before her looked like something from a fever dream. A single-room log cabin hunched against the mountainside, its roof patched with everything from tar paper to what appeared to be an old cavalry blanket. Smoke drifted lazily from a crooked chimney, and a small vegetable garden, now mostly withered with autumn's approach, struggled in the rocky soil beside the structure. A lean-to served as a makeshift stable, though no horses were visible within. It was the man who held her attention. He stood in the cabin's doorway like a scarecrow come to life, his shotgun trained steadily on her chest. His hair hung past his shoulders in greasy tangles. His beard was unkempt and shot through with premature gray, and his clothes, what remained of them, hung loose on his gaunt frame. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes, held an intelligence that spoke of education, of refinement long abandoned. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," he said again, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Feed me and I'll serve you." Elizabeth studied him with the same careful attention she had once reserved for choosing the season's fabrics. This was no simple mountain hermit. The way he held the weapon spoke of military training, and despite his deteriorated appearance, she could see the ghost of the man he had once been. His posture, even in his weakened state, carried the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "You're a soldier," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Something flickered across his face pain. Regret, perhaps both. Was, long time ago. What's your name? He hesitated, as if the simple question carried dangerous weight. Ezekiel Boone. Most folks called me Zeke, back when there were folks to do the calling. I'm Elizabeth Van Cleef, Mrs. Charles Van Cleef of St. Louis. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Bit far from home, aren't you, Mrs. Van Cleef? Further than I intended. She gestured toward the cabin. May I sit? It's been a long walk. Ezekiel lowered the shotgun slightly, but didn't invite her inside. Instead, he nodded toward a stump that served as a chopping block. Elizabeth gathered her ruined skirts and settled herself with as much dignity as she could manage. The simple act of sitting felt like a luxury after 3 days of stumbling through wilderness. The stagecoach, she began, then stopped. Even now, the memory made her hand shake. There were 4 of them. They killed poor Mr. Henderson. He was driving and took everything. My trunk, my traveling bag, even my reticule. I managed to slip away while they were arguing over the contents, but I've been wandering ever since. Lucky to be alive, Ezekiel observed. Brennan's gang doesn't usually leave witnesses. You know them? Know of them. Bad men, Mrs. Van Cleef. The kind that give outlaws a worse name than they already have. He studied her face carefully. They see you get away? I don't think so. They were quite occupied with my belongings. She touched the locket at her throat. Though I suppose they'll notice eventually that I'm not among the... She couldn't finish the sentence. Among the dead, Ezekiel completed gently. Probably already have, if they're worth the reputation they've built. The implications of his words settled over her like a cold blanket. She was not merely lost in the wilderness, she was being hunted. That offer you made, she said after a long moment. Feed you and you'll serve me. What exactly does that entail? Ezekiel leaned against the doorframe, the shotgun now resting in the crook of his arm. Means I'll get you to the nearest town alive. Means I'll share what little shelter I have and what knowledge I've gathered about surviving in this country. Means I'll put myself between you and whatever comes looking for you, Mrs. Van Cleef, because that's what a man does for a woman who shows him kindness. And in return, a meal. Maybe 2, if you can spare them. Haven't had much luck hunting lately, and winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in my bones. Elizabeth looked at this strange, broken man and saw something she recognized. Same hollow grief that had stared back at her from mirrors for 2 long years. Whatever had driven Ezekiel Boone to this remote corner of creation, it hadn't been a simple love of solitude. I have no money, she said honestly. No supplies, no. Food to offer you. The bandits took everything. I've got dried venison, some beans. A little coffee, if we're careful with it. He gestured toward the garden. Managed to grow some squash and turnips before the frost hit. We can make do. Then why? Because I haven't sat across a table from another human being in 8 months, Mrs. Van Cleef. Because I haven't heard a voice other than my own in so long. I sometimes wonder if I've forgotten how to speak. Because you're the first person in this godforsaken territory who's looked at me like I might still be human. The raw honesty in his voice struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man as broken by life as she had been, perhaps more so. Whatever. Demons had driven him to this isolation. They had been feeding on him for far longer than her 2 years of widowhood. Very well, she said, rising from the stump with what dignity she could muster. I accept your terms, Mr. Boone, though I warn you, I know nothing of frontier life. I'm more likely to be a burden than a help. We'll see about that. He stepped aside, gesturing her toward the cabin's interior. Come on then, let's get you fed and warm. Morning's soon enough to figure out how to keep us both alive. The cabin's interior was sparse, but surprisingly clean. A single room held everything, a rough-hewn table with 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow bed built into one corner, Shelves lined with what appeared to be books wrapped in oilcloth, and a stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. The smell of wood smoke mixed with something else, leather, gun oil, and the faint scent of herbs drying from the rafters. Elizabeth settled into one of the chairs, her legs suddenly unsteady now that safety, or something resembling it, was within reach. Ezekiel busied himself at the fire, adding wood and stirring something in a cast iron pot suspended over the flames. "Venison stew," he said without looking at her. "Nothing fancy, but it'll fill the empty spaces. It smells wonderful." And it did. Elizabeth couldn't remember the last time she had been truly hungry. Not the polite appetite of a society lady, but the deep, gnawing hunger that made every aroma a promise of salvation. Her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl, and she pressed her hand to her corseted waist in embarrassment. "No shame in being hungry," Ezekiel said, ladling the stew into 2 wooden bowls. "Body's just reminding you it's still alive." He set a bowl before her along with a carved wooden spoon, then took his place across the table. The stew was simple chunks of venison, wild onions, and what might have been root vegetables she couldn't identify, but it was the finest meal she could remember tasting. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft scrape of spoons against wood. Elizabeth found herself studying her host over the rim of her bowl. Despite his unkempt appearance, his table manners suggested breeding, education. He held his spoon properly, chewed with his mouth closed, and waited until she had finished before taking a second helping. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Finally, what did you expect? Someone less?" She searched for the right word. "Less civilized, I suppose." Ezekiel's laugh held no humor. "Civilization's a thin coat of paint, Mrs. Van Cleef. Takes less than you'd think to scrape it away." "Is that what happened to you? Your paint got scraped away?" His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. Then he set the utensil down carefully and met her eyes. "Something like that," he said quietly. "War has a way of showing a man what he's really made of underneath all the pretty words and noble intentions. Sometimes what's underneath isn't worth preserving." Elizabeth nodded slowly. She understood something about that about the person. "You thought you were dissolving under pressure, leaving behind someone you barely recognized. How long have you been here?" she asked. 2 years, give or take. Maybe closer to 3. Time moves different when you're alone. The same amount of time she had been a widow. The coincidence seemed too pointed to ignore. "And before that?" "Before that, I was someone else entirely." She waited, but he offered nothing more. Whatever had brought Ezekiel Boone to this remote cabin, he wasn't ready to share it with a stranger, no matter how desperate their circumstances. "The books," she said, nodding toward the oilcloth-wrapped volumes on the shelves. "You read?" "When the mood strikes. Helps pass the long evenings." He followed her gaze. "Got some philosophy, some poetry, few novels. Even found a medical text in an abandoned wagon train. Never know what might prove useful. I'd love to see them, if you don't mind. It's been days since I've seen anything civilized." Something in his expression softened. "Help yourself. Most of them are in decent shape." Considering, Elizabeth rose and approached the shelves with something approaching reverence. The books were indeed carefully preserved, wrapped in oilcloth and arranged with obvious care. She selected one at random and unwrapped it carefully, a volume of Emerson's essays, well worn but intact. "The only way to have a friend is to be one." She read aloud from a marked passage. "Emerson was an optimist," Ezekiel observed. "Probably never spent a winter alone in the Montana Territory. Perhaps not. But perhaps he understood something about human nature that transcends geography." She rewrapped the book carefully and returned it to its place. When she turned back to the table, she found Ezekiel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read: surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "You're not what I expected either," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "Someone less civilized." Elizabeth smiled for the first time in days. "Civilization's a thin coat of paint, Mr. Boone, but sometimes, when it's applied properly, it can last through quite a lot of weather." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's single window and reminding them both of how precarious their situation truly was. Winter was coming. Hunters might be following her trail, and they were two broken souls with nothing but each other and the uncertain promise of survival. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, with the simple meal settling in her stomach, and the presence of another human being pushing back the vast loneliness of the wilderness, Elizabeth Van Cleef felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 long years. She felt hope. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Ezekiel moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire and preparing what passed for breakfast. The pale light filtering through the single window told her dawn had barely broken, but she could see her breath in the cold air. During the night, autumn had given way to something sharper, more urgent. She had slept fitfully on a pile of blankets Ezekiel had arranged near the fireplace, her dreams filled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the crack of gunfire. More than once she had jolted awake, her heart pounding, only to find herself safe within the cabin's rough walls. But safety, she was beginning to understand, was a relative term in this country. "Morning, Mrs. Van Cleef," Ezekiel said without turning from the fire. He wore the same clothes as the day before, worn wool trousers held up by suspenders, a faded blue shirt that had seen better decades. But his hair was damp, suggesting he had made some attempt at washing, and his beard looked slightly more kempt. "Coffee's ready, if you can call it that." Elizabeth sat up carefully, every muscle in her body protesting. 3 days of stumbling through wilderness had left her sore in places she hadn't known could ache. Her traveling dress was beyond salvaging now, the fine silk reduced to little more than rags held together by stubborn stitching. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was weak and bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. "I'm afraid I'm not accustomed to rising quite so early." "Sun'll be full up in an hour," Ezekiel replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Want to get a good look at the country while the light's clear. Need to know if we had any visitors during the night." The casual way he said it made Elizabeth's stomach clench. "You think they followed my trail?" "I think Brennan's gang doesn't leave loose ends if they can help it. And I think you're about as loose an end as they come." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "The question is whether they tracked you here or gave up and moved on to easier prey. How will we know?" "We'll know." After a breakfast of leftover stew and hard biscuits that could have served as building materials, Ezekiel led her outside for what he called reading the country. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, and she pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Frost covered everything in a delicate silver coating that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Ezekiel moved through the landscape like a man reading a familiar book, his eyes scanning tracks in the dirt. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves. Elizabeth followed as quietly as she could, marveling at his ability to extract meaning from what appeared to her as random wilderness. "3 riders," he said, crouching beside a patch of soft earth near the creek that ran behind his cabin. "Came through sometime after midnight, circled the cabin twice, then headed north toward the pass." Elizabeth's blood felt like ice water in her veins. "They found us. They found something. Whether they know what they found is another question." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Could be they're just checking every homestead in the territory. Could be they picked up your trail and followed it here. Could be they know exactly who's inside my cabin and are planning their next move. What do we do?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "We prepare for the worst and hope for something better." That's about all a person can do. In this life, Mrs. Van Cleef. They spent the morning taking inventory of supplies and discussing options. Ezekiel's provisions were sparse enough food for one person to survive a month, maybe 6 weeks if he was careful. With 2 mouths to feed, they had perhaps 3 weeks before facing starvation. The nearest town is Copper Falls, he explained, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. 2 weeks hard travel through country that gets meaner every mile. 3 weeks if we take the safe route, which might not be safe anymore anyway. And if we stay here? Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in the air, see it in how the animals are behaving. We'd need at least twice the supplies I've got stored, and that's assuming we don't have unwelcome visitors. Elizabeth studied the map, noting the careful detail with which he had marked landmarks, water sources, and what appeared to be danger zones. You drew this yourself. Army training. Always know your ground, my sergeant used to say. Good advice. As it turned out, you were a surveyor? Scout. Reconnaissance mostly, sometimes other things. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Things I'd rather not discuss over breakfast. Elizabeth nodded, filing away another piece of the puzzle. That was Ezekiel Boone. Whatever had happened during his military service, it cast a long shadow over his present life. If we leave, she said, when would we need to go? Soon. Next few days at the latest. Once the snow starts in earnest, we'll be trapped here until spring, assuming we live that long. The casual mention of death, their possible death, should have terrified her. Instead, Elizabeth found herself oddly calm. Perhaps it was because she had already faced the worst thing she could imagine, the loss of Charles. Perhaps it was because she had spent 3 days certain she was going to die alone in the wilderness, making any alternative seem preferable. Or perhaps it was simply that fear had exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange kind of peace. Then we'll leave, she said simply. Ezekiel looked up from the map, surprise flickering across his face. Just like that? Just like that. You offered to get me to the nearest town alive, Mr. Boone. I'm holding you to that bargain. It won't be easy. You're not equipped for that kind of travel, and I don't have the supplies to properly outfit you. We'll be traveling light and fast, sleeping rough, eating whatever we can find or kill along the way. Then, you'll have to teach me. Teach? You what? How to survive. How to move quietly. How to find food. How to... She gestured helplessly. How to be useful instead of a burden. Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, a softening around the eyes that made him look younger, less haunted. You're not a burden, Mrs. Van Cleef. Different kind of challenge, maybe, but not a burden. What's the difference? A burden's dead weight. A challenge makes you think, adapt, grow stronger. He folded the map carefully. You've got backbone. I'll give you that. Most ladies of your station would be having the vapors about now. Most ladies of my station have. Never been widowed at 62 and left to fend for themselves in a world that suddenly makes no sense. Elizabeth smoothed her ruined skirts with hands that had grown rough over the past few days. I may not know how to survive in the wilderness, Mr. Boone, but I know how to endure. And I know how to learn. Fair enough. But learning frontier skills isn't like learning to embroider or speak French. Make a mistake out here, and it can get you killed. Get both of us killed. Then I won't make mistakes. Ezekiel laughed. First genuine laughter she had heard from him. Spoken like someone who's never tried to start a fire in the rain or track game through snow. But I appreciate the confidence. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Ezekiel showed her how to pack efficiently, how to layer clothing for warmth without bulk, how to move through underbrush without making noise. Elizabeth approved a quick learner, though her soft hands blistered from unfamiliar work, and her feet ached in her impractical city boots. We'll need to do something about those shoes, Ezekiel said. eyeing her delicate leather boots with disapproval. "They might be fine for walking down Fifth Avenue, but they'll cripple you before we make 5 miles in this country. What do you suggest? I've got some leather, some tools. Can probably cobble together something more suitable. Won't be pretty, but they'll keep your feet attached to your ankles." As evening approached, they sat by the fire sharing another meal of venison stew. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves with a sound that spoke of winter's approach. Elizabeth found herself studying her companion in the flickering light, noting the careful way he ate, the alertness that never quite left his posture, even in the relative safety of his own cabin. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Why are you helping me? I mean, truly helping me, not just honoring some frontier code of hospitality?" Ezekiel set down his spoon and stared into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. "Because 8 months ago, I watched 3 men die badly because I was too wrapped up in my own misery to pay attention to what was happening around me. Because I've spent so long feeling sorry for myself that I forgot what it means to be useful to another human being. Because you're the first person in longer than I can remember who's looked at me and seen something worth saving." The raw pain in his voice caught her off guard. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her own. His skin was warm, calloused from hard work, marked with old scars she didn't ask about. "I think," she said gently, "that we might be saving each other." Ezekiel turned his hand palm up, his fingers closing around hers. They sat like that for a moment, 2 broken people drawing strength from an unexpected connection. While outside, the wind howled and winter gathered its forces for the long siege ahead. "Mrs. Van Cleef," he said finally. "Elizabeth, I think, given our circumstances, we can dispense with some formalities. Elizabeth, then, tomorrow we start preparing in earnest. Day after that, we leave at first light. From that moment on, every decision we make could mean the difference between seeing another sunset or becoming food for the wolves. You understand?" "That? I understand." "Good. Because once we leave this cabin, there's no going back. No matter what we face out there, we see it through to the end." Elizabeth looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man who had offered her hope when she had none left. Whatever lay ahead, winter storms, pursuing bandits, or simply the grinding hardship of survival in an unforgiving land, she would face it beside someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. To the end, she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Ezekiel moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire and preparing what passed for breakfast. The pale light filtering through the single window told her dawn had barely broken, but she could see her breath in the cold air. During the night, autumn had given way to something sharper, more urgent. She had slept fitfully on a pile of blankets Ezekiel had arranged near the fireplace, her dreams filled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the crack of gunfire. More than once she had jolted awake, her heart pounding, only to find herself safe within the cabin's rough walls. But safety, she was beginning to understand, was a relative term in this country. "Morning, Mrs. Van Cleef," Ezekiel said without turning from the fire. He wore the same clothes as the day before, worn wool trousers held up by suspenders, a faded blue shirt that had seen better decades. But his hair was damp, suggesting he had made some attempt at washing, and his beard looked slightly more kempt. "Coffee's ready, if you can call it that." Elizabeth sat up carefully, every muscle in her body protesting. 3 days of stumbling through wilderness had left her sore in places she hadn't known could ache. Her traveling dress was beyond salvaging now, the fine silk reduced to little more than rags held together by stubborn stitching. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was weak and bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. "I'm afraid I'm not accustomed to rising quite so early." "Sun will be full up in an hour," Ezekiel replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Want to get a good look at the country while the light's clear? Need to know if we had any visitors during the night." The casual way he said it made Elizabeth's stomach clench. "You think they followed my trail?" "I think Brennan's gang doesn't leave loose ends if they can help it. And I think you're about as loose an end as they come." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "The question is whether they tracked you here or gave up and moved on to easier prey. How will we know?" "We'll know." After a breakfast of leftover stew and hard biscuits that could have served as building materials, Ezekiel led her outside for what he called reading the country. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, and she pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Frost covered everything in a delicate silver coating that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Ezekiel moved through the landscape like a man reading a familiar book, his eyes scanning tracks in the dirt. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves. Elizabeth followed as quietly as she could, marveling at his ability to extract meaning from what appeared to her as random wilderness. 3 riders, he said, crouching beside a patch of soft earth near the creek that ran behind his cabin. Came through sometime after midnight. Circled the cabin twice, then headed north toward the pass. Elizabeth's blood felt like ice water in her veins. They found us. They found something. Whether they know what they found is another question. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Could be they're just checking every homestead in the territory. Could be they picked up your trail and followed it here. Could be they know exactly who's inside my cabin and are planning their next move. What do we do? Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. We prepare for the worst and hope for something better. That's about all a person can do. In this life, Mrs. Van Cleef. They spent the morning taking inventory of supplies and discussing options. Ezekiel's provisions were sparse enough food for one person to survive a month, maybe 6 weeks if he was careful. With 2 mouths to feed, they had perhaps 3 weeks before facing starvation. The nearest town is Copper Falls, he explained, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. 2 weeks hard travel through country that gets meaner every mile. 3 weeks if we take the safe route, which might not be safe anymore anyway. And if we stay here? Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in the air, see it in how the animals are behaving. We'd need at least twice the supplies I've got stored, and that's assuming we don't have unwelcome visitors. Elizabeth studied the map, noting the careful detail with which he had marked landmarks, water sources, and what appeared to be danger zones. You drew this yourself. Army training. Always know your ground, my sergeant used to say. Good advice. As it turned out, you were a surveyor? Scout. Reconnaissance, mostly. Sometimes other things. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Things I'd rather not discuss over breakfast. Elizabeth nodded, filing away another piece of the puzzle. That was Ezekiel Boone. Whatever had happened during his military service, it cast a long shadow over his present life. If we leave, she said, when would we need to go? Soon. Next few days at the latest. Once the snow starts in earnest, we'll be trapped here until spring, assuming we live that long. The casual mention of death, their possible death, should have terrified her. Instead, Elizabeth found herself oddly calm. Perhaps it was because she had already faced the worst thing she could imagine, the loss of Charles. Perhaps it was because she had spent 3 days certain she was going to die alone in the wilderness, making any alternative seem preferable. Or perhaps it was simply that fear had exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange kind of peace. Then we'll leave, she said simply. Ezekiel looked up from the map, surprise flickering across his face. Just like that? Just like that. You offered to get me to the nearest town alive, Mr. Boone. I'm holding you to that bargain. It won't be easy. You're not equipped for that kind of travel, and I don't have the supplies to properly outfit you. We'll be traveling light and fast, sleeping rough, eating whatever we can find or kill along the way. Then you'll have to teach me. Teach you what? How to survive. How to move quietly. How to find food. How to... She gestured helplessly. How to be useful instead of a burden. Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, a softening around the eyes that made him look younger, less haunted. You're not a burden, Mrs. Van Cleef. Different kind of challenge, maybe, but not a burden. What's the difference? A burden's dead weight. A challenge makes you think, adapt, grow stronger. He folded the map carefully. You've got backbone. I'll give you that. Most ladies of your station would be having the vapors about now. Most ladies of my station have never been widowed at 62 and left to fend for themselves in a world. That suddenly makes no sense. Elizabeth smoothed her ruined skirts with hands that had grown rough over the past few days. I may not know how to survive in the wilderness, Mr. Boone, but I know how to endure, and I know how to learn. Fair enough. But learning frontier skills isn't like learning to embroider or speak French. Make a mistake out here, and it can get you killed. Get both of us killed, then I won't make mistakes. Ezekiel laughed the first genuine laughter she had heard from him, spoken like someone who's never tried to start a fire in the rain or track game through snow. But I appreciate the confidence. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Ezekiel showed her how to pack efficiently, how to layer clothing for warmth without bulk, how to move through underbrush without making noise. Elizabeth proved a quick learner, though her soft hands blistered from unfamiliar work and her feet ached in her impractical city boots. We'll need to do something about those shoes, Ezekiel said, eyeing her delicate leather boots with disapproval. They might be fine for walking down Fifth Avenue, but they'll cripple you before we make 5 miles in this country. What do you suggest? I've got some leather, some tools. Can probably cobble together something more suitable. Won't be pretty, but they'll keep your feet attached to your ankles. As evening approached, they sat by the fire sharing another meal of venison stew. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves with a sound that spoke of winter's approach. Elizabeth found herself studying her companion in the flickering light, noting the careful way he ate, the alertness that never quite left his posture, even in the relative safety of his own cabin. May I ask you something? She said finally. You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Why are you helping me? I mean truly helping me, not just honoring some frontier code of hospitality. Ezekiel set down his spoon and stared into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. Because 8 months ago, I watched 3 men die badly because I was too wrapped up in my own misery to pay attention to what was happening around me. Because I've spent so long feeling sorry for myself that I forgot what it means to be useful to another human being. Because you're the first person in longer than I can remember who's looked at me and seen something worth saving. The raw pain in his voice caught her off guard. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her own. His skin was warm, calloused from hard work, marked with old scars she didn't ask about. I think, she said gently, that we might be saving each other. Ezekiel turned his hand palm up, his fingers closing around hers. They sat like that for a moment, 2 broken people drawing strength from an unexpected connection, while outside the wind howled and winter gathered its forces for the long siege ahead. Mrs. Van Cleef, he said finally. Elizabeth. I think, given our circumstances, we can dispense with some formalities. Elizabeth, then. Tomorrow we start preparing in earnest. Day after that, we leave at first light. From that moment on, Every decision we make could mean the difference between seeing another sunset or becoming food for the wolves. You understand? That? I understand. Good, because once we leave this cabin, there's no going back. No matter what we face out there, we see it through to the end. Elizabeth looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man who had offered her hope when she had none left. Whatever lay ahead, winter storms, pursuing bandits, or simply the grinding hardship of survival in an unforgiving land, she would face it beside someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. To the end, she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The next morning brought with it the first real test of their partnership. Elizabeth woke before dawn to find Ezekiel already up, his movements sharp with urgency as he gathered supplies from various hiding places around the cabin. "We've got company," he said without preamble, nodding toward the window. "Same 3 riders from yesterday, plus 2 more. They're being careful, staying back in the tree line, but they're there." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be they're just watching, trying to figure out what they're dealing with. Could be they're waiting for full daylight to make their move." He handed her a leather satchel. "Either way, we need to be ready to run." The next hour passed in tense preparation. Ezekiel showed Elizabeth how to pack only the absolute essentials: a change of clothes, basic medical supplies, enough food for 3 days if they were careful. Everything else, including most of his books and all the small comforts that had made the cabin livable, would have to be left behind. "It's hard," he said, watching her wrap Charles's photograph carefully in oilcloth before tucking it into her satchel. "Leaving behind pieces of who you used to be. Is that what you did when you came here? Left behind pieces of yourself?" Ezekiel's hand stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. "I left behind everything. Name, rank, reputation, all of it. Sometimes starting over means burning the old life down to ash and hoping something better grows from what's left." Elizabeth wanted to ask more, but the intensity of his focus on their preparations told her this wasn't the time for deeper conversation. Instead, she concentrated on learning the skills he was trying to teach her: how to move silently, how to read the forest for signs of danger, how to find north without a compass. Her first attempts were clumsy and loud. She caught her skirts on branches, stepped on every twig in their path, and managed to trip over roots that seemed to materialize from nowhere. But Ezekiel was patient in a way that surprised her, correcting her mistakes without criticism, showing again and again until her movements began to improve. "Better," he said after her 5th attempt at crossing a stretch of fallen leaves without making noise. "You're starting to think like the forest instead of fighting it. I don't understand what you mean. City folks, no offense, tend to move through the world like they own it. Make noise, demand attention, expect everything to get out of there. Way, out here, that attitude will get you killed. You have to become part of the landscape, move with it instead of against it." Elizabeth tried again, this time placing her feet more carefully, feeling for solid ground before committing her weight. The improvement was marginal, but it was improvement. "My husband always said I was too stubborn for my own good," she said, pausing to catch her breath. "Perhaps that will serve me well here. Stubborn's good, as long as it doesn't make you stupid." Difference between determination and bullheadedness can mean the difference between living and dying. They spent the morning practicing basic wilderness skills in the cover of the forest behind Ezekiel's cabin. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to find water even when none was visible, how to build a shelter using nothing but what the forest provided. Elizabeth's hands, soft from years of genteel living, began to blister and crack from the unfamiliar work. "Here," Ezekiel said, noticing her trying to hide her discomfort. He pulled a small tin from his pack and handed it to her. "Salve I make. from pine resin and bear fat. Not pretty, but it'll help. The salve smelled terrible, but soothed the burning in her palms. As she rubbed it into her skin, she noticed Ezekiel's hands scarred, calloused, marked by years of hard use. They were the hands of someone who had learned to survive by necessity rather than choice. "How long did it take you to learn all this?" she asked. "Which part?" "The army taught me some of it: tracking, wilderness survival, how to live off the land when supply lines got cut. The rest I picked up the hard way after I came here." "The hard way?" "Trial and error. Mostly error at first. Nearly starved my first winter. Poisoned myself twice eating the wrong berries. Got lost for 3 days, trying to find my way back to the cabin from a creek that was less than a mile away." He smiled grimly. "Pride's a luxury you can't afford when you're trying not to die." Elizabeth found herself oddly comforted by his honesty. The man teaching her to survive had made his own share of mistakes and lived to learn from them. It made her own clumsy efforts seem less hopeless. By midday, the watchers in the forest had grown bolder. Twice, Ezekiel had spotted movement closer to the cabin, and once they had heard the distinct sound of a horse nickering in the distance. "They're getting impatient," he said, checking his rifle for the 3rd time in an hour. "That's good and bad. Good, because impatient men make mistakes. Bad, because impatient men also do stupid things, and stupid things tend to be violent. What do? We stick to the plan. Soon as dark falls, we head north toward the pass. There's an old game trail that follows the ridgeline harder going, but it'll keep us out of sight of anyone watching the main routes." Elizabeth nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The idea of traveling through unknown wilderness in the dark terrified her, but staying put seemed even more dangerous. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they made their final preparations. Ezekiel cached some of his remaining supplies in hidden spots around the cabin, explaining that they might need to return someday or that other travelers might find them useful. "Always plan for the possibility of coming back," he said, sealing a tin of ammunition inside a hollow log. "Even when you're sure you never will." Elizabeth watched him work with growing admiration. Everything he did was purposeful, efficient, born of experience she was only beginning to appreciate. This man had survived alone in hostile country for years, had learned to thrive where others would perish. Whatever demons had driven him to this solitude, they hadn't broken his fundamental competence. "Ezekiel," she said as he finished his preparations, "thank you." "For what?" "For not leaving me behind. For taking the time to teach me instead of just dragging me along. For treating me like a partner instead of dead weight." He straightened, studying her face in the fading light. "You're not dead weight, Elizabeth. Different kind of strength. Maybe, but strength all the same. Takes backbone to leave everything you know and trust a stranger to keep you alive. I didn't have much choice in the matter. There's always a choice. You could have given up, could have decided it wasn't worth the fight. Instead, you're here, learning to survive, refusing to quit even when everything's against you." He shouldered his pack, testing its weight. "That's not resignation, Elizabeth. That's courage." As darkness finally settled over the mountains, they made their way carefully to the cabin's back door. Ezekiel went first, moving like a shadow through the trees, every sense alert for signs of danger. Elizabeth followed as quietly as she could, her new understanding of forest movement helping her avoid the worst of the noise-making obstacles. The watchers were still there. She could feel their presence like a weight in the darkness, though she couldn't see them. But Ezekiel's training and the concealment offered by night allowed them to slip away from the cabin undetected, beginning the long journey toward an uncertain sanctuary. Behind them, the small log structure that had offered Elizabeth her first taste of hope sat empty and dark, waiting for whatever morning would bring. Ahead lay 2 weeks of brutal travel through country that grew more dangerous with each mile. but for the first time since the ambush, Elizabeth Van Cleef felt like she might actually survive what was coming. More than that, she felt like she might emerge from it stronger than she had been before. 3 days into their journey, Elizabeth discovered muscles she never knew existed. Every step sent sharp pains through her legs and back, and her feet felt like raw meat inside the makeshift boots Ezekiel had cobbled together from spare leather and determination. But she had not complained once, and she was proud of that small victory. They had made good time despite her inexperience, following game trails that Ezekiel seemed to know by instinct. He moved through the wilderness with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent learning to read the land, to anticipate its moods and dangers. Elizabeth tried to mirror his movements, and slowly, painfully, she was beginning to understand the rhythm of wilderness travel. "You're getting better," he said during their midday rest, noting how she had navigated the last rocky slope without stumbling. "Starting to trust your feet instead of fighting them?" Elizabeth massaged her aching calves through her torn stockings. "I feel like I've been trampled by horses." "You have been, in a way. The land's testing you, seeing if you're worth keeping alive. So far, you're passing." They were resting beside a small creek that tumbled down from the high peaks. Its water so clear, Elizabeth could count the pebbles on the bottom. Ezekiel had shown her how to purify water using cloth and charcoal from their fire, how to identify which plants could supplement their dwindling food supplies, how to read the sky for weather signs. "Storm coming," he said now, studying the clouds, building over the western mountains. "Big one from the look of it. We'll need to find shelter soon." "How can you tell?" "Color of the clouds, the way the wind's shifting, how the birds are acting. See how quiet everything's gotten. Animals know when bad weather's coming. They hunker down and wait it out." Elizabeth looked around and realized he was right. The forest had fallen eerily silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. Even the creek seemed to murmur more quietly. "There's a cave system about 2 miles north," Ezekiel continued, shouldering his pack. "Used it before when I was scouting this area. Not comfortable, but it'll keep us dry." As they resumed walking, Elizabeth found herself watching Ezekiel with growing fascination. His knowledge of the wilderness seemed inexhaustible, but it was more than just practical skills. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, reading signs and signals she was only beginning to notice. "You said you were a scout in the army," she said, careful to keep her voice low. "What did that involve, exactly?" Ezekiel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories. "Reconnaissance. Mostly. Go where the regular troops couldn't, see what the enemy was doing, report back. Sometimes we'd guide larger units through difficult country. Sometimes we'd—" He stopped abruptly. "Sometimes we'd do things that needed doing but weren't fit for polite conversation." Elizabeth heard the pain in his voice and chose her next words carefully. "The war changed you. War changes everyone. Question is whether it changes you into something better or something worse." He pushed aside a low-hanging branch, holding it so she could pass safely. "Jury's still out on which direction I went." They walked in companionable silence after that. The only sounds their footsteps on the forest floor and the distant rumble of thunder. Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at her companion, trying to reconcile the gentle teacher of the past few days with the haunted warrior she glimpsed in unguarded moments. The cave Ezekiel had promised turned out to be a narrow opening in a limestone cliff, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. But inside, it opened into a chamber large enough to stand upright, with evidence of previous human habitation, a circle of stones for a fire, dried wood stacked against one wall. "You've used this place before," Elizabeth observed. "Fair number of times. Good shelter, fresh water from a spring in the back, and hard to find unless you know where to look." He began building a fire with practiced efficiency, Figured it might come in handy someday. As if summoned by his words, the first drops of rain began pattering against the cliff face outside. Within minutes, it had become a downpour that would have soaked them to the skin in seconds. Perfect timing, Elizabeth said, settling gratefully onto a flat rock near the growing fire. Luck favors the prepared, Ezekiel replied, but there was satisfaction in his voice. Besides, I could smell that storm coming 2 hours ago. Pine sap, ozone, the way the air gets thick before it breaks. Elizabeth pulled her leather journal from her pack, checking to make sure it had remained dry. She had been writing in it each evening, documenting their journey and her growing understanding of this harsh country. More than that, she had been trying to capture her changing impressions of the man who had become her lifeline. "What are you writing about?" Ezekiel asked, noticing her careful handling of the journal. "Our journey. The things you've taught me. The way this place changes a person." She looked up from the pages. "Would you mind if I wrote about you?" Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. "Not much worth writing about." "I disagree. You've shown remarkable patience with a woman who knew nothing about surviving in your world. You shared your knowledge freely, never made me feel foolish for my ignorance. That's worth documenting." Ezekiel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. "You see me different than I see myself. How do you see yourself?" "As a man who ran away from his responsibilities and hid in the wilderness like a coward. As someone who let good people die because he was too wrapped up in his own misery to pay attention to what mattered." The raw self-condemnation in his voice made Elizabeth's heart ache. She had glimpsed this darkness in him before, but never so directly expressed. "What happened?" she asked gently. Ezekiel was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, rain drumming against stone and wind howling through the peaks above them. Finally, he began to speak. There was a wagon train, settlers heading for Oregon Territory, guided by a man who didn't know the country half as well as he claimed. They hired me to scout ahead, find water, safe camping spots, routes that would keep them away from hostile tribes. He paused, lost in memory. Elizabeth waited, sensing that this story needed to come out at its own pace. Everything went wrong at once. Late start, bad weather, broken wagons. We were 3 weeks behind schedule when we hit the desert country, and water was getting scarce. The guide wanted to take a shortcut through Apache territory. I told him it was suicide, but he wouldn't listen. Said I was being overcautious. Elizabeth could see where this was leading, and her heart went out to the pain she could hear building in his voice. I should have refused. Should have made them listen or walked away entirely. Instead, I let my pride get in the way. Figured I could scout ahead, keep them safe through sheer competence and careful planning. His laugh held no humor. Turns out competence doesn't matter much when you're dealing with 50 seasoned Apache warriors who know every rock and gully. For 100 miles, you were ambushed. Slaughtered is more like it. I was 2 miles ahead when I heard the shooting start. By the time I got back, it was over. 37 people dead, including 6 children. The ones who survived the initial attack were tortured. He looked directly at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight like broken glass. I spent the next 2 days tracking the survivors, finding their bodies one by one. Could have prevented all of it if I'd been stronger, smarter, more willing to fight the guide's stupidity. Elizabeth reached across the space between them and took his hand. It was shaking slightly, she realized, though whether from emotion or the memory of old trauma, she couldn't tell. It wasn't your fault, she said quietly, wasn't it? I was supposed to keep them safe. That was the job, the responsibility I accepted. Instead, I failed them in the worst possible way. You were one man against impossible odds. You couldn't have, I could have done more. The words came out harsh, final. Could have threatened to leave if they didn't listen. Could have disabled their wagons to force them to take the safe route. Could have sent word to the nearest army post, brought in soldiers to escort them properly. Instead, I took the easy path and told myself it would probably work out. Elizabeth understood now why he had retreated to this remote corner of Montana, why he carried himself like a man bearing an invisible burden. The guilt he felt over those deaths had been eating at him for years, driving him into self-imposed exile. Is that why you left the army? Army left me, more like. Court-martial found me guilty of negligence, stripped my rank, gave me a choice between military prison and civilian disgrace. I chose disgrace and came here to drink myself to death in private, but you didn't die. No, turned out I was too stubborn even for that. He squeezed her hand gently. Until 3 days ago, I thought that was a failing. Now I'm beginning to wonder if maybe I stayed alive for a reason. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. This broken, haunted man had found the strength to help her when she needed it most, had shared his knowledge and protection despite his own pain. Perhaps they really were saving each other. I'm glad you stayed alive, she said simply. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside their small sanctuary, something had shifted between them. The barriers of formality and careful distance had given way to something deeper, more honest. Elizabeth knew that when morning came, they would continue their dangerous journey as more than just traveling companions. They would travel as friends. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the cave with nothing but each other's company and the growing awareness that their relationship had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate alliance between strangers was evolving into something neither had expected, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and the kind of trust that only comes from facing danger together. On the second morning, Elizabeth woke to find Ezekiel carving something by the fire's dying light. His hands moved with surprising delicacy, shaping what appeared to be a piece of pale wood into something smooth and curved. "What are you making?" she asked, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. "Comb," he said without looking up. "Noticed yours got broken when we were climbing over those rocks yesterday." Elizabeth touched her hair self-consciously. After days in the wilderness, it had become a tangled mass that she had been struggling to manage with her fingers. The ivory comb that had been part of her toilette for 40 years had indeed broken beyond repair during their climb. "You don't need to. I want to." He held up the piece, examining his work. "Been a long time since I made something useful for another person. Feels good." There was something touching about watching this hardened man carefully crafting such a delicate personal item. Elizabeth found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the concentration in his expression, the way his scarred hands handled the wood with unexpected gentleness. "Where did you learn to carve?" "My father was a carpenter back in Ohio. Taught me to work with wood when I was barely tall enough to reach his workbench. Said a man who could make useful things with his hands would never go hungry." Ezekiel's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Turned out he was right, just not in the way he expected. What did he expect you to become? A carpenter, like him? Maybe a furniture maker, if I showed enough skill. He had hopes I'd take over his business, settle down with a nice local girl, give him grandchildren to spoil. The carving stilled in his hands. Instead, I joined the army the day I turned 18 and broke his heart in the process. Elizabeth heard the regret in his voice and chose her words carefully. "Did you ever see him again?" "Once. Came home on leave about 5 years later, wearing my sergeant's stripes and full of stories about the frontier. He was proud, I could tell, but also sad. Said I'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone harder than the boy who'd left. War does that to people. War, distance, time, choices that seemed right in the moment that looked different in hindsight. He resumed his carving, the blade whispering against the wood. He died while I was out west, chasing Apache raiders through desert country. Never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell him I understood what he was trying to teach me about making something lasting instead of just breaking things down. Elizabeth felt a familiar ache in her chest, the pain of words left unspoken, love unexpressed, until it was too late. We all carry those regrets. What are yours? The question caught her off guard. In the past few days, she had become accustomed to learning about Ezekiel's history, but he had rarely asked about hers. I never told Charles how proud I was of him, she said finally. He spent our entire marriage trying to build something worthy. The business, our home, a reputation in the community. I supported him, of course, but I never said the words he needed to hear. I thought there would always be time for that conversation. What would you have told him? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, watching the flames dance against the cave. Walls, that he was the finest man I ever knew. That his kindness mattered more than his success. That watching him care for others' employees who were struggling, neighbors who needed help, even strangers who came to our door, taught me what it meant to live with purpose. Sounds like he knew, even without the words. Perhaps. But it would have been good to say them anyway. Ezekiel held up the finished comb, examining it in the firelight. It was simple but elegant, carved from what she now recognized as pine, with smooth tines and a handle shaped to fit comfortably in her hand. It's beautiful, she said, accepting it with something approaching reverence. It's functional. Beauty's just what happens when you take care with the details. Elizabeth ran the comb through her tangled hair, marveling at how the simple tool transformed the painful process of detangling into something almost soothing. But more than the practical value, she was moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift, the recognition of her need, the time and skill invested in meeting it. Thank you, she said, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could convey. Welcome. They spent the day talking in a way they hadn't before, not just about practical matters of survival, but about their lives, their dreams, the paths that had led them to this unlikely partnership. Elizabeth learned that Ezekiel had once wanted to be a teacher, that he could recite poetry from memory, that he had read more philosophy than most college professors. The Army had a library, he explained when she expressed surprise at the breadth of his knowledge. Not much, but enough to keep a curious mind occupied during the long winters. I read everything I could get my hands on, Marcus Aurelius, Emerson, even some German philosophy that was probably too deep for a simple soldier. You're hardly a simple soldier. I was then. Took me years to understand that thinking and fighting didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that a man could be both warrior and scholar without losing his soul to either calling. As evening approached and the storm began to show signs of breaking, they prepared a meal from their dwindling supplies. Elizabeth had learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of hot food and warm shelter, luxuries she had once taken for granted. We should reach the trading post tomorrow, Ezekiel said, studying his hand-drawn map. If the weather holds and we make good time. Kowalski's place, he's a good man. Been out here almost as long as I have. He'll have supplies, maybe news from the outside world. Will it be safe? Safer than staying in the open. Kowalski's got no love for bandits, and his place is built like a fortress. Besides, we're running low on food, and winter's coming weather. We're ready or not. Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of encountering other people after their days of solitude made her oddly nervous. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of traveling with just Ezekiel, to the quiet understanding that had developed between them. What happens after we reach town? She asked. That's up to you. I can arrange passage back to St. Louis, if that's what you want. Or you could stay in Copper Falls, start over somewhere new. It's not much of a town, but it's civilized enough. For someone with your background? And you? Ezekiel poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling toward the cave ceiling. Haven't decided yet. Might head further west, try California. Might go north into Canada. Might just find another mountain to hide behind. The casual way he discussed leaving made Elizabeth's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Over the past week, this man had become more than just her protector and guide. He had become her connection to hope, to the possibility that life could still offer unexpected gifts even after devastating loss. You don't have to keep running, she said quietly. Don't I? The man who carved this comb, who's kept me alive and taught me to survive, who's shown me kindness when he had every reason to think only of himself. That man has nothing to run from. Ezekiel looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite read: surprise, gratitude, something deeper and more complex. You see me different than I see myself, he said, echoing his words from the night before. Maybe that's what we need sometimes. Someone to show us who we really are instead of who we think we have to be. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, the wind dying down and the rain gentling to a steady patter. Tomorrow they would continue their journey toward uncertain sanctuary, but tonight they sat together in the warm circle of firelight, two souls who had found unexpected companionship in the vast loneliness of the wilderness. Elizabeth ran the handmade comb through her hair one more time, feeling its smooth warmth against her palm, and realized that somewhere along the trail she had stopped, thinking about survival, and started thinking about something else entirely. She had started thinking about hope. The trading post appeared through the morning mist like something from a frontier fairy tale, a cluster of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, and the blessed sight of civilization after a week in the wilderness. Elizabeth felt her heart lift at the prospect of a real bed, hot food, and perhaps even a bath. But her relief was tempered by the awareness that reaching Kowalski's place would bring decisions neither she nor Ezekiel had been willing to discuss. During their journey, what happened next? Where would they go from here? The questions hung between them like morning fog, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Remember, Ezekiel said as they approached the main gate, we're married. Been living up north near the Canadian border, heading south to winter in warmer country. Simple story, easy to remember, hard to verify. Elizabeth nodded, though the pretense of marriage sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. What if someone recognizes you? Kowalski's discreet. Been selling supplies to men with complicated pasts for 20 years without asking uncomfortable questions. As for the others, he shrugged. We'll handle whatever comes. The trading post's interior was a wonder of frontier commerce shelves, lined with everything from ammunition to ladies' undergarments, barrels of flour and beans, displays of knives and tools, even a small selection of books. The air smelled of leather, tobacco, and wood smoke, with an underlying hint of the exotic spices that found their way west along the trading routes. Stefan Kowalski himself was a bear of a man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Ezekiel with the careful warmth of old acquaintances who respected each other's privacy. Zeke, he said, extending a massive hand. Been a while. You're looking better than last time I saw you. Clean living, Ezekiel replied with a slight smile. Stefan, I'd like you to meet my wife Elizabeth. The lie came so naturally that Elizabeth almost believed it herself. She offered her hand to Kowalski, who took it with surprising gentleness. Ma'am, pleasure to meet you. Any wife of Zeke's is welcome here. His eyes took in her travel-worn appearance without judgment. You folks look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed. That would be a blessing, Elizabeth said, and meant it. They were shown to a small but clean room above the trading post's main floor. It contained a real bed, the first Elizabeth had seen in over a week, along with a washstand, a mirror, and the luxury of a window that looked out over the surrounding mountains. "I'll have my woman bring up some hot water," Kowalski said. "Supper's at 6 if you're interested. Got venison stew and fresh bread." After he left, Elizabeth found herself alone with Ezekiel in the intimate space of their shared room. The pretense of marriage suddenly felt more complicated, charged with possibilities and awkwardness in equal measure. "I can sleep on the floor," Ezekiel said, reading her discomfort. "Don't be ridiculous. We're both adults, and it's a large bed. I think we can manage to share space without compromising anyone's virtue." But even as she said it, Elizabeth was acutely aware of how the past week had changed her feelings toward this man. What had begun as gratitude had evolved into something deeper, more complex. She found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, noticing the way his eyes softened. When he spoke to her, the gentle strength in his hands. "I need to see about supplies," Ezekiel said, apparently unaware of her inner turmoil. "Food for the rest of the journey, maybe warmer clothes for you. Winter gear, if Kowalski's got any in your size." "How much will all that cost?" Ezekiel's expression grew uncomfortable. "I've got some money saved. Not much, but enough for what we need." Elizabeth reached into her pack and withdrew something she had been saving for exactly this moment, her mother's ring. A delicate band of gold set with small diamonds that had been in the Van Cleef family for 3 generations. "No," Ezekiel said immediately, seeing what she intended. "I won't let you sell family jewelry to pay for supplies. It's just a ring, Ezekiel. And we need those supplies more than I need a reminder of the past. It's not just a ring. It's your heritage, your connection to who you were before all this started." Elizabeth looked down at the ring, remembering her mother slipping it onto her finger on her wedding day, the tears in the older woman's eyes as she whispered blessings for a long and happy marriage. It had been beautiful then, and it was beautiful now, but it belonged to a life that no longer existed. "Who I was before this started was a woman who had everything handed to her and never truly understood its value," she said quietly. "I'm becoming someone different now, someone who understands that relationships matter more than possessions. That survival requires sacrifice. That love." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she had almost said. "That love what?" Ezekiel asked softly. Elizabeth met his eyes, seeing in them the same confusion and longing she felt in her own heart. "That love is worth more than gold or diamonds or anything else we might lose along the way." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken possibilities. They stood there in the small room, 2 people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for, neither quite brave enough to name what was happening between them. Finally, Ezekiel reached out and gently closed her fingers around the ring. "Keep it," he said. "Not because I don't understand what you're offering, but because someday you might want to remember the woman who was generous enough to offer it." The touch of his hands on hers sent warmth racing up her arms. Elizabeth found herself stepping closer, drawn by something stronger than logic or propriety. "Ezekiel," she whispered. "Elizabeth." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. They were standing so close now that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could smell the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. His hands were still wrapped around hers, warm and calloused and infinitely gentle. "This is complicated," he said, though he made no move to step away. "Everything worthwhile is complicated. You deserve better than a broken-down ex-soldier with more regrets than prospects. Don't I get to decide what I deserve?" Before he could answer, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, but it carried with it all the emotion that had been building between them during their journey. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "Elizabeth," Ezekiel said again, but this time her name sounded different, like a promise, like hope, like the beginning of something that might actually last. "I know this is crazy," she said, her hands still resting on his chest. "I know we barely know each other, that we're both carrying too much past to make this simple. But I also know that in the past week, you've shown me who I really am underneath all the layers of convention and expectation. You've made me feel alive again." "You've done the same for me," he admitted. "For the first time in years, I wake up with something to look forward to instead of just another day to endure." They stood there holding each other, two broken people, discovering that they might be stronger together than they had ever been apart. Outside their window, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to bless their unlikely beginning. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. "I don't know," Ezekiel said honestly. "But whatever it is, I'd like to face it with you. Even if it means giving up your life as a hermit. Especially then. Turns out being alone isn't the same thing as being free." Elizabeth smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and an uncertain future. But tonight, in the warmth of each other's arms, she felt rich beyond measure. She had found love in the last place she had expected to look, and it was worth more than all the gold and diamonds in the world. Elizabeth woke the next morning to find Ezekiel already gone from their shared bed. Sunlight streamed through the window, and she could hear the sounds of commerce beginning in the trading post below, voices haggling over prices, the creak of wagon wheels, horses nickering in the yard. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply lie there, remembering the previous evening's kiss and the promise it represented. But when she dressed and made her way downstairs, she found Ezekiel standing, rigid near the front counter, his face pale as winter sky. In his hands was a piece of paper that looked official, formal, and deeply troubling. "What is it?" she asked, though something in his expression made her stomach clench with dread. He handed her the paper without speaking. It was a wanted poster, printed on good paper with clear type, bearing a photograph that was unmistakably Ezekiel, though younger, clean-shaven, wearing an army uniform with sergeant's stripes clearly visible. "Wanted," the poster read in bold letters. Ezekiel Jonathan Boone, for desertion in the face of the enemy, dereliction of duty resulting in civilian deaths, and failure to prevent massacre of wagon train under military protection. Reward, $500 dead or alive. Elizabeth read it twice, then looked up at Ezekiel's stricken face. "Where did this come from?" "Kowalski found it in a bundle of papers a trader dropped yesterday," he said quietly. "Been carrying it around all night, trying to figure out how to tell me." Stefan Kowalski appeared from behind the counter, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Zeke. I know it ain't the whole story, never is, with these things, but I had to show you. If I found it, others will too." Elizabeth studied the poster more carefully, noting details that hadn't registered on first reading. The photograph was at least 5 years old. The description mentioned specific battle locations, and the language carried the weight of official military judgment. "This makes it sound like you ran away from a fight," she said. "Because that's what they want people to think." Ezekiel's voice was bitter with old anger. Easier to blame one man for a disaster than admit the whole system failed. "Tell me what really happened." Ezekiel glanced around the trading post, knowing the other customers who were trying not to obviously listen to their conversation. Not here. Too many ears. They retreated to their room, where Ezekiel sat heavily on the bed and put his head in his hands. Elizabeth waited, sensing that this story needed to come out at its own pace. "The poster's not entirely wrong," he said finally. "I did desert. But not in the face of the enemy because of the enemy. Because of what my own commanding officers were asking me to do. Which was, you remember I told you about the wagon train massacre? What I didn't tell you was that it wasn't random. It was planned, set up, used as bait." Elizabeth felt ice form in her veins. "What do you mean?" Ezekiel looked up at her with eyes that held years of pain and rage. Colonel Marcus Whitfield had a theory about dealing with hostile tribes. He believed that if civilians were killed in spectacular fashion, it would generate enough outrage back east to justify a major military campaign. Bigger budgets, more troops, promotions for everyone involved. You're saying he deliberately put those people in danger? I'm saying he ordered me to guide them through Apache territory during the height of raiding season, knowing full well what would happen. When I objected, he told me it was for the greater good, but sacrificing a few dozen settlers would save hundreds of lives in the long run by ending Apache resistance permanently. Elizabeth sank into the room's single chair, horrified. But you went along with it, at first. I was a soldier, trained to follow orders, trust my superior's judgment. I told myself that maybe Whitfield was right, that maybe there was some larger strategy I couldn't see. His voice grew rough with self-condemnation. I was a fool. What changed your mind? I met them, the families. Talked to the children, helped. Fixed their wagons, shared meals around their campfires. They weren't anonymous statistics. They were real people with hopes and dreams and loved ones waiting for them in Oregon. And I was leading them to slaughter like sheep to the butcher. So, you tried to stop it. I tried. God help me. I tried everything I could think of. I sabotaged their wagons to slow them down, hoping the delay would make Whitfield call off the plan. I reported false information about Apache movements, trying to convince the guide to take a safer route. I even went to Whitfield directly and begged him to reconsider. What did he say? That I was getting too emotionally involved. That sentiment had no place in military strategy. He reminded me that insubordination was a court-martial offense and suggested I remember where my loyalties were supposed to lie. Elizabeth was beginning to understand the impossible position Ezekiel had been placed in. So you deserted 3 days before the massacre. I couldn't be part of it anymore. Couldn't pretend I was protecting those people when I was actually delivering them to their deaths. I left my post, rode hard to Fort Campbell, and tried to report what was happening to Whitfield's superiors. What did they do? Ezekiel's laugh was harsh and humorless. Nothing. Whitfield had already sent word that I was suffering from nervous exhaustion, that I'd been making wild accusations and behaving erratically. By the time I could get anyone to listen to me, the wagon train was already under attack. And when the massacre happened, Whitfield had his scapegoat, a deserter who had abandoned his post and left innocent civilians to die. The investigation was perfunctory. They needed someone to blame, and I was conveniently available. The fact that I'd tried to prevent the whole thing became evidence of premeditation, proof that I'd known what was coming and ran to save my own skin. Elizabeth felt sick. The man she had come to love, the gentle teacher who had carved her a comb and shown her how to survive in the wilderness, had been destroyed for trying to do the right thing. The court-martial found you guilty. Unanimous verdict. Desertion, dereliction of duty, contributing to the deaths of 37 civilians. They gave me a choice: 20 years in military prison or immediate discharge and civilian prosecution. I chose discharge and disappeared before the civilian authorities could get their hands on me. And Whitfield? Promoted to general 6 months later. The Apache campaign he'd wanted got full funding, and he became a hero for avenging the massacre he'd orchestrated. Last I heard, he was being considered for a position in Washington. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, absorbing the full horror of what Ezekiel had endured. No wonder he had retreated to the wilderness, consumed by guilt and rage. He had tried to save innocent lives and been punished for it, while the men responsible for their deaths were rewarded. How many other people know the truth? She asked finally. A few. Some of the other scouts suspected, but they weren't about to risk their careers contradicting official reports. A couple of the wagon train survivors lived long enough to tell their version, but who's going to believe civilians over army officers? Someone must have tried to clear your name. My sergeant, Jim Hawkins, spent 2 years trying to get the case reopened. Lost his stripes for it, eventually got drummed out of the service entirely. Last letter I got from him, he was working as a store clerk in Kansas City, still trying to find someone who'd listen. Elizabeth stood and began pacing the small room, her mind racing. The wanted poster changed everything, not just about Ezekiel's past, but about their future. As long as he was a wanted man, they could never be truly safe, never build the life together that had seemed so possible just hours before. The reward, she said suddenly. $500 is serious money. People will be looking for you. People have been looking for me for 3 years. I've managed to stay ahead of them so far. But now they know you're in the area. That poster didn't appear by accident. Someone's been tracking you, putting out fresh bounties. She stopped, pacing, and looked at him directly. We can't stay here. No, we can't. And you can't be seen with me anymore. Association with a wanted fugitive would destroy your reputation, make you an accessory after the fact. Elizabeth felt anger flare in her chest. Don't you dare try to make that decision for me. Elizabeth, be reasonable. You have a chance to start over, build a new life somewhere safe. I won't let you throw that away for a man with no future. You're wrong about having no future. We can fight this, clear your name. Find those survivors who lived, track down your sergeant, build a case. With what money? What lawyers? What influence? Ezekiel shook his head sadly. The army closes ranks around its own, Elizabeth. They'll never admit they promoted a monster and destroyed an innocent man. Too much reputation at stake, too many careers that would be ruined. Then we run, together. We find somewhere they'll never think to look. Start completely over. Run where? This poster will be in every town from here to California inside a month. And what kind of life would that be for you always looking over your shoulder, never able to use your real name, constantly afraid of being discovered? Elizabeth moved to the window and stared out at the mountains, thinking furiously. Somewhere out there were people who wanted to capture or kill the man she loved, who saw him as nothing more than a bounty to be collected. The unfairness of it made her want to scream, but underneath her anger was something else, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. Ezekiel had saved her life, shown her who she could become, given her hope when she had none. Now it was her turn to fight for him. I won't leave you, she said, turning back to face him. I don't care about the danger or the difficulty. I won't abandon you to face this alone. Elizabeth, no. Her voice was firm, final. You said yesterday that you wanted to face whatever came next together. Did you mean it, or were those just pretty words? Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment, seeing in her face the same stubborn courage that had carried her through a week in the wilderness. Slowly, something in his expression shifted from despair to hope. I meant it, he said quietly. Then we face this together. All of it. She moved to him, taking his hands in hers. I don't care if you're wanted by the army, Ezekiel. I know who you really are, and that's the man I choose to stand with. Outside, the sounds of the trading post continued normal life proceeding for people whose biggest worry was the price of flour or the weather forecast. But inside their small room, Elizabeth and Ezekiel held each other against an uncertain future, bound together by something stronger than fear or law or the judgment of distant men who had never faced the choices that test a person's true character. They were bound by love and by the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for no matter what the cost. 3 days of hard travel had brought them within sight of Cedar Ridge when everything went wrong at once. Elizabeth first noticed the problem when she realized the birds had stopped singing. The forest around them had fallen into the kind of unnatural silence that spoke of predators, nearby human predators who moved with enough noise to frighten the wildlife, but not enough to be immediately obvious to their quarry. Ezekiel, she whispered, touching his arm. He was already reaching for his rifle, his body coiled with the tension of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. I know. 4 of them, maybe 5. Been following us since we crossed the creek 2 miles back. Elizabeth's mouth went dry, but her hands remained steady as she checked her own weapon. The past 3 weeks had changed her in ways she was still discovering, where once she would have panicked. Now she found herself calculating distances, cover options, escape routes. Can we outrun them? Not with a 2-day head start and horses. Ezekiel's eyes scanned the terrain around them with practiced efficiency. They've been herding us toward this spot for the past hour. Probably got more men waiting ahead. They were in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber, with a rocky outcropping to their left and a steep ravine to their right. It was, Elizabeth realized with growing dread, an ideal place for an ambush-limited escape routes. Clear fields of fire, natural barriers that would prevent retreat. How did they find us? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Someone at the trading post talked, or they got lucky and picked up our trail. Ezekiel moved to the edge of the clearing, using a large pine for cover. Doesn't matter now. What matters is getting out of here alive. The sound of horses moving through the underbrush was becoming more distinct. Elizabeth could hear voices now, low and careful but growing closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but underneath the fear was something else, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her. With its intensity, these men wanted to kill or capture the person she loved. They were agents of a system that had destroyed an innocent man to protect guilty ones. And she would be damned if she let them succeed without a fight. What do you need me to do? She asked, moving to take position behind a fallen log that offered good cover and a clear view of the approaching threat. Ezekiel glanced at her, and she saw approval mixed with concern in his expression. Stay low, pick your shots carefully, and remember everything I taught you about breathing and trigger control. Don't try to be a hero. If they get past me, you run for that ravine and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Elizabeth, no. Her voice was firm, final. We faced this together, remember? That was the deal. The first rider appeared at the edge of the clearing before Ezekiel could respond. A lean man with hard eyes and a badge glinting on his vest. A bounty hunter then, not a soldier. That was both good and bad good, because bounty hunters weren't trained military. Bad because they were motivated by greed rather than duty, which made them unpredictable. Ezekiel Boone, the man called out, his voice carrying the flat confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, and I've got a legal warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands up, and nobody needs to get hurt. Legal warrant from who? Ezekiel called back, not moving from his cover. Last I checked, the Army doesn't issue civilian warrants. Things have changed, Boone. You're wanted for more than just desertion now. Got testimony that you've been robbing travelers, maybe even killed a few. Makes you a federal fugitive, which puts you in my jurisdiction. Elizabeth felt anger flare in her chest. More lies, more manipulation from the same system that had destroyed Ezekiel's reputation once before. They weren't content to frame him as a coward. Now they were painting him as a common criminal. You know that's not true, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. A moment of surprised silence followed her words. Clearly, they hadn't expected him to have a companion, let alone a woman. Ma'am, Bradley said, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as reassuring. I don't know what this man has told you, but he's dangerous. You need to step away from him right now, before you get caught up in something that ain't your fault. The only dangerous thing here is the lie you're trying to perpetuate, Elizabeth replied, her finger resting lightly on her rifle's trigger. Ezekiel Boone is a good man who tried to prevent a massacre and was punished for it. If you're here to capture him, you're working for the wrong side. Lady's got a mouth on her. Another voice said from the trees, younger, cruder, with the kind of laugh that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "Maybe we ought to teach you some manners after we're done with Boone." The threat was a mistake. Elizabeth felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest, the same protective fury that had driven her to leave her comfortable life and follow a wanted man into the wilderness. "You can try," she said quietly, and meant every word. Ezekiel glanced at her with something that might have been pride. "You heard the lady, Bradley. She's not interested in your version of justice." "Neither am I. Have it your way, then." Bradley's voice hardened. "Boys, take them alive if you can. Dead if you can't. Either way, we're not leaving here empty-handed." The attack came from 3 directions at once. Elizabeth heard the crack of rifles and the whistle of bullets cutting through the air over her head. Felt bark explode from the log she was sheltering behind. But instead of panic, she found herself moving with a clarity and purpose that surprised her. She sighted carefully on a muzzle flash from the trees, squeezed the trigger just as Ezekiel had taught her, and was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of someone crashing through the underbrush. Her first shot in anger had found its mark. "Good girl," Ezekiel said, working the action of his own rifle with mechanical precision. "Keep your head down and make every shot count." The battle had begun in earnest now, and Elizabeth discovered that all her fears about violence, about her ability to defend herself and the man she loved, had been groundless. When the moment came, when the choice was between submission and resistance, she chose to fight with every fiber of her being. She was no longer the helpless widow who had stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago. She was a woman defending her future, her love, and her right to choose her own destiny. And she would not be defeated by lies, corruption, or the crude men who served them. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Elizabeth found herself moving and shooting with an efficiency that would have amazed the woman she had been a month ago. Every lesson Ezekiel had taught her about survival, about reading the land and anticipating danger, came together in those crucial moments. She had wounded one of their attackers with her first shot, but there were still at least 3 more hidden in the timber around them. Bradley was directing the assault from behind a cluster of boulders 30 yards away, his voice carrying commands that spoke of military experience despite his civilian badge. "Circle around to the left," he called to someone Elizabeth couldn't see. "Woman's covering that side, but she's just a scared civilian. Put some pressure on her and she'd break." Elizabeth smiled grimly and adjusted her position, waiting for the flanking movement Bradley had ordered. Let them underestimate her. It would be the last mistake they ever made. The man who tried to work his way around her position was young, maybe 25, with the cocky confidence of someone who had never faced real opposition. He moved carelessly, making too much noise, probably expecting to find a terrified woman cowering behind inadequate cover. Instead, he found Elizabeth waiting with her rifle trained on the exact spot where the terrain would force him to break cover. When he stepped into the open, she squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The young man dropped like a stone, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers. Elizabeth felt a moment of profound sadness, not for his death, but for the waste of a life spent serving corrupt masters. Then another bullet splintered the wood near her head, and there was no more time for philosophy. "That's 2 down," she called to Ezekiel, who was engaged in a deadly game of position with Bradley and the remaining attackers. "Good shooting," he replied, his voice tight with concentration. "But we've got bigger problems. They're not trying to capture us anymore. They're going for kill shots." Elizabeth could see what he meant. The bullets coming their way were aimed to kill, not wound. Whatever orders Bradley had received, they apparently included permission to bring back bodies instead of prisoners. "The ravine," Ezekiel said during a brief lull in the shooting. "We need to make a break for it before they get organized enough to surround us completely." Elizabeth looked toward the steep-sided gully that cut through the forest floor 20 yards to their right. It offered concealment and possibly an escape route, but reaching it would mean exposing themselves to enemy. Fire for precious seconds. On 3, Ezekiel said, checking his ammunition. I'll lay down covering fire. You run for that big rock at the ravine's edge. Soon as you're in position, you cover me. Elizabeth nodded, her heart hammering but her hands steady. This was the kind of coordinated movement that required absolute trust, perfect timing, and no small amount of luck. 1, Ezekiel counted, his rifle ready. 2. Before he could say 3, the forest erupted in gunfire from a new direction. For a terrifying moment, Elizabeth thought more bounty hunters had arrived. Then she heard a familiar voice shouting orders, and her heart nearly stopped with relief. Federal marshals. Drop your weapons and surrender. Jim Hawkins appeared through the trees like an avenging angel, leading 3 genuine deputy marshals in a flanking movement that caught Bradley's men completely off guard. The bounty hunters found themselves caught in a crossfire, outnumbered and outflanked by legitimate law enforcement. Bradley, Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 20 years giving orders and having them obeyed. You're done here. Stand down or face the consequences. Bradley's response was a wild shot in Hawkins' direction, followed by a shouted curse that carried his desperation clearly across the clearing. He's a wanted fugitive. I've got legal papers. Forged papers, Hawkins replied calmly, advancing with professional precision. And you're not a real deputy marshal, Tom. Haven't been for 6 months. Not since you got caught taking bribes from General Whitfield to hunt down innocent men. The revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Even the arrest warrant had been fake, another layer of deception in the conspiracy that had destroyed Ezekiel's life. Whitfield's finished, Bradley, Hawkins continued. We've got witnesses, documents, testimony from 3 wagon train survivors who've been hiding for years, afraid to speak up. The whole story's coming out, and everyone who helped cover it up is going down with him. Elizabeth saw Bradley's face through a gap in the trees, saw the moment when he realized his situation was hopeless. But instead of surrendering, the false marshal made one last desperate play. If I'm finished, then so is Boone, he screamed, rising from cover with his rifle aimed directly at Ezekiel. Elizabeth didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't consider the consequences or weigh her options. She simply acted on the protective instinct that had been growing stronger every day since she had first kissed the man she loved. She threw herself between Bradley and Ezekiel just as the rifle fired. The bullet meant for Ezekiel's heart caught her in the shoulder instead, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the forest floor. Pain exploded through her body, bright and immediate, but underneath it was a fierce satisfaction. She had saved him. Whatever else happened, she had saved the man she loved. Elizabeth! Ezekiel's voice was raw with anguish as he dropped beside her, his hands already working to staunch the bleeding. Why did you? Because I love you, she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fire in her shoulder. Because you're worth saving. Because someone needed to protect the protector for once. The gunfire had stopped. Through the ringing in her ears, Elizabeth could hear Hawkins shouting orders, the sound of men being taken into custody, the organized chaos of law enforcement cleaning up after violence. But her world had narrowed to Ezekiel's face above her, his eyes bright with tears and something deeper than gratitude. You magnificent, impossible woman, he said, pressing his field dressing against her wound. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. And neither were you. Elizabeth managed a weak smile. I'd say that makes us even. Hawkins appeared beside them, his weathered face creased with concern. How bad is it? Clean through the shoulder, Ezekiel reported, his field medic training taking over. Missed the major blood vessels, but she needs a doctor soon. Cedar Ridge has got one. Good man. Fought in the war. Knows how to handle gunshot wounds. Hawkins helped Ezekiel fashion a better bandage. And Zeke? You're a free man. Full presidential pardon came through yesterday, along with restoration of rank and back pay. General Whitfield's under arrest, along with everyone who helped him cover up that massacre. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, not from pain, but from relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. It was over. The lies, the running, the constant fear of discovery, all of it was finished. It's really over? She asked. It's really over, Hawkins confirmed. You can go home, both of you. Build whatever life you want without looking over your shoulders. Elizabeth looked up at Ezekiel, seeing in his face the same wonder she felt in her own heart. They were free not just from pursuit, but from the weight of false accusations and undeserved shame. They could be together openly, honestly, with no secrets and no fear. Where do you want to go? Ezekiel asked gently, helping her sit up despite her wound. Elizabeth looked around at the Montana wilderness that had become the crucible of their love, at the forest that had taught her who she really was, at the man who had shown her that life could offer second chances to those brave enough to seize them. Home, she said simply. Wherever that is, as long as we're together. Together, Ezekiel agreed, and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. Around them, the forest was beginning to come alive again as the wildlife returned after the violence. Birds resumed their singing, and somewhere in the distance, Elizabeth could hear the sound of flowing water, the creek that would carry them toward their new life. She had been shot, but she had never felt more alive. She had faced down armed men and won. She had saved the life of the man she loved and secured their future together. The helpless widow from St. Louis was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it. When the people she loved were threatened, Elizabeth Van Cleef had finally learned how to fight for what mattered most. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood at the window of their small cabin overlooking the valley where Cedar Ridge nestled among the rolling hills of eastern Montana. Her shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that she wore, like a badge of honor, proof of the day she had chosen love over safety, action over fear. The cabin was simple but comfortable, built with Ezekiel's own hands, using skills his father had taught him decades ago. It wasn't grand like the Van Cleef mansion in St. Louis had been, but it was theirs in a way that no inherited wealth could ever be. Every board, every joint, every carefully crafted detail represented their shared commitment to building something lasting together. "Morning, Mrs. Boone," Ezekiel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and nuzzling her neck with the familiarity of a husband who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Elizabeth leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural the name sounded now. They had been married by the circuit judge 2 weeks after her shoulder healed, in a simple ceremony attended by Jim Hawkins and a handful of their new neighbors. She had worn a dress of blue cotton instead of silk, had carried wildflowers instead of orchids, and had never felt more beautiful in her life. "Good morning, Sergeant Boone," she replied, using the title that had been restored to him along with his honor. "Sleep well?" "Like a man with a clear conscience and a warm bed," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Though I still wake up sometimes wondering if this is all a dream." Elizabeth turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more precious to her with each passing day. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by something she had never expected to see their peace. The guilt that had driven him into exile had been lifted by official vindication, and the knowledge that the truth had finally been told. Not a dream, she assured him, rising on her toes to kiss him gently. Just life being kinder than either of us expected. Through the window, she could see the garden they had planted together coming into full summer bloom. Vegetables and flowers, grew side by side in organized rows that spoke of careful planning and patient tending. It was a practical garden, designed to feed them through the coming winter. But Elizabeth had insisted on the flowers, roses, and delphiniums that served no purpose except to bring beauty into their daily lives. "Speaking of dreams," Ezekiel said, producing a letter from his shirt pocket. "This came yesterday, from Jim." Elizabeth recognized the careful handwriting of Ezekiel's former sergeant, the man whose persistence and courage had finally brought the truth to light. Jim Hawkins had become not just their savior, but their friend, a connection to the larger world they had chosen to leave behind. What does he say? General Whitfield got 20 years in military prison. 3 of his subordinates got lesser sentences, and 2 more were drummed out of the service in disgrace. Ezekiel's voice carried satisfaction, but no vindictiveness. He had found peace with his past, rather than victory over his enemies. The families of the wagon train victims are finally getting the recognition and compensation they deserved. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. Justice, so long delayed, had finally been served. The innocent dead could rest in peace, their memories no longer tainted by lies and cover-ups. "There's more," Ezekiel continued. "The Army's offered me a position training. Scouts, teaching wilderness survival to new recruits. Full colonel's rank, good pay. Chance to make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Elizabeth studied his face carefully. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd think about it. That I needed to discuss it with my wife before making any decisions that would affect both our lives." The fact that he had included her in such a momentous choice spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. They were true partners now, each respecting the other's wisdom and judgment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley that had become their sanctuary. "Part of me wants to take it. Chance to serve again, to use what I learned in a way that might help other soldiers avoid the kinds of moral traps I fell into. But another part of me thinks we've earned the right to a quiet life, just the 2 of us." Elizabeth followed his gaze to the garden, the mountains beyond, the small community that had welcomed them without question or judgment. It was a good life they had built, simple, honest, filled with the kind of daily contentment she had never learned to appreciate in her previous existence. "We have earned that right," she agreed. "But we've also learned that the most meaningful lives are often the ones spent in service to something larger than ourselves." "You think I should take the commission?" "I think you should do whatever will let you sleep peacefully 20 years from now. Which path leads to fewer regrets?" Ezekiel smiled, and she could see in his expression that she had helped him find the answer he had already known in his heart. "The teaching position," he said. "If I can prevent even one massacre, save even one innocent life, help even one young soldier understand the difference between following orders and doing what's right, then maybe all the pain we went through will have served a purpose." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride in the man she had married. He had suffered greatly for his principles, had paid a terrible price for refusing to compromise his conscience, but he was still choosing service over safety, purpose over comfort. "Then we'll make it work," she said simply. "Together." "The positions?" "Based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. We'd have to leave here, start over again in a new place." "I've gotten rather good at starting over," Elizabeth replied with a smile. "Besides, home isn't a place anymore. It's wherever we are together." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, a young couple appeared on the path leading to their cabin, new settlers heading west, looking for directions and perhaps a meal. Elizabeth recognized the expression on their faces, the mixture of hope and uncertainty that marked people in transition, searching for something better than what they were leaving behind. "Looks like we have visitors," Ezekiel observed, already moving toward the door. "I'll put coffee on," Elizabeth said, falling into the routine they had developed for welcoming travelers. and see if there's enough stew left from last night. As they prepared to open their home to strangers, Elizabeth reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate morning, when she had first encountered a starving mountain man with wild eyes and an unexpected offer. She had been seeking sanctuary then, running from grief and loss toward an uncertain future. Now she was offering sanctuary to others, sharing the hard-won wisdom that came from learning to trust, to love, to fight for what mattered most. The woman who had boarded that stagecoach in St. Louis had been afraid of uncertainty, dependent on others for protection, more concerned with appearances than with authentic living. The woman who opened her cabin door to welcome weary travelers was strong in ways she had never imagined possible, capable of protecting those she loved, and utterly committed to building a life of substance rather than show. "Welcome," she said, to the young couple, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Come in and rest. You're safe here." And as Ezekiel added his own welcome, as they began the familiar ritual of sharing food and shelter with people who needed both, Elizabeth Van Cleef Boone smiled with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had finally learned what it meant to be truly alive. Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what truly matters. Sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you discover that what matters most is not what you have, but who you choose to share it with and who you choose to become in the process of loving them. Elizabeth had found her answer to both questions, and it was more than enough.